You know that one of the things the Lord warned was, when the Lord returns to earth, will he find faith on earth? Well, the reason is that he knew he wouldn't be believed because of the mixing of the two gospels. As we already know, I've told you this many times, that there is the gospel of the circumcision that we mention so often, and the gospel of the uncircumcision. So those are two gospels. One ended on the cross and another began on the cross. And if one is not careful with these two gospels, then one falls into apostasy. And it's not that the person is bad, it's that the person has fallen into apostasy. He is an apostate because he holds to a false gospel. Those two gospels must be clearly defined. And we try to explain that because once a person understands which gospel they are in, they find their place and are enlightened. And we are going to read from Romans 10:5. Well, Romans 10 verses 4 and 5, because that's where it is. The gospel of the circumcision, one of the gospels. And then in Romans 10:8 is the other one. There are the two starts. See how it says, Romans 10:4, this is the first verse we will use. It says, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. For Moses writes about the righteousness which is of the law. The man who does those things shall live by them. So we see that circumcision has to do with doing, with works, since faith cannot be applied to circumcision because then you would not be in circumcision. However, we see that the uncircumcision begins in verse 8, right there. In Romans chapter 10 verse 8 it says, but what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart, in your mind. That is the word of faith which we preach. And so the very beginning, this marks the beginning of the gospel of the uncircumcision. It begins by saying, this is the word of faith we preach. It is close to you, to your mouth. Remember when we talked about the mouth last time? Because the mouth defines what is in your heart. And if your heart is set on works, then you no longer live by faith. That is why apostasy exists. It comes from those two sources. That is where James says that from one mouth, from one spring, fresh and bitter water flows. This is the big situation, the global problem. The so-called Christian churches have lost sight of that stretch. It is quite a simple stretch of road. But if misunderstood, you fall into works, not faith. So the conclusion is that for 2,000 years, people have been living under this false gospel.